by common consent in human rationality, the question of whether or not God exists is not a small issue, right? Everything depends on it. And so we continue. For he must do one of two things. Either he must learn or discover the truth about these matters. That is, continue the investigation until you get to the bottom of it. And you can't just sit there and not decide. You've got to take a position and then move forward. If you made the wrong decision, you bear the consequences of that, and hopefully you make a better decision next time. But you can't just sit there. That's cowardly, he says here. And then I love what comes next.
John Wise, thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, me too, Mitch. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Such a gracious man. Very nice to interact with people who are humble and up for having a conversation. It's very refreshing. So I think people who find this interview will probably know your background. So we can just dive into talking about sort of the nuts and bolts, and I'm eager to get your opinion on all sorts of different things. So maybe we can start from what exactly made you turn away from your belief in God originally and go to atheism. I know you've talked about Jean-Paul Sartre and sort of that was a key element for you, but I'm curious what, maybe some of the more specifics were. And then you could talk a little bit about what it was that ended up defeating your atheism. I mean, we'll get there eventually, but maybe we can start there.
Sure. If I have to boil it down, this would be the conclusion rather than the premises leading up to it. I would say it was what the Bible calls the pride of life. While I was in Bible college, I found myself unable to defend the challenges that were brought against Christianity and theism. And I started to get involved with studying philosophy and present-day science. And the more I became ensconced in those two things, the clearer it was to me that I didn't have the answers, and I wanted the answers desperately. And it seemed to me as though the most promising avenue forward was to follow science and philosophy and see where they took me. And I often say that it was sort of at that moment, I sort of formulated a life project for myself to follow the truth wherever it led, and see, where I ended up. And if that meant, even as a Christian in Bible college at that time, if it meant that I had to abandon my faith, then so be it.
Right. And do you remember, was there a particular, like, I know Bart Ehrman talks about how it was pretty much for him, it was like the contradictions that he started seeing textually and that kind of stuff. Like, so I guess at a certain point he said, okay, all of this just became too much, and then he became an atheist. Do you remember, like, was there something like that for you that made you take a right turn kind of thing?
Well, there was a particular moment. I had already gone through graduate school at a college outside of Philadelphia called Westchester University. And I was still a nominal Christian at the time. And I came across the work of a philosopher named Immanuel Benchavenga at the University of California, Irvine. And I got really fascinated by his work on Immanuel Kant. And then through some really interesting things I won't go into, I ended up out at the University of California, Irvine, studying philosophy. And I think it was in the second semester there in my PhD work that I was walking across campus one day, and I just said to myself, you know what, there is no God. And what was it in particular? I don't think, much like the case of coming back to Christianity, that I can point to any particular, argument or moment where it became overwhelming, but it was the larger structure of things that led me to the point of saying, okay, I got to make a decision here. Because at this point, the second year of my graduate studies, I'd come to think, well, I don't know. I just don't know. I don't have a good answer here. I had left Bible college, and I said to myself, I'm not convinced by this. But the atheism, that seemed like a step too far. But then I remembered C.S. Lewis's book, The Magician's Nephew. And we'll actually talk about this a little bit more later. And Lewis talks about the woods between the worlds. And that became kind of like a metaphor for me for agnosticism, which is where I was standing at the time. And I said, well, I got to jump into one of these pools, one or the other. You can't stand here in the middle because it's not going to get you anywhere. And so I said, okay, I'm going to be an atheist. And that was it. I didn't look back for 25 years.
Right. Okay. Great analogy too. And Magician's Nephew is such a good book. I feel like that's one of the books from the whole Narnia series that is, like, at least in pop culture, kind of forgotten about a bit. It's always Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, but Magician's Nephew is my original love of Narnia. Okay, yeah, that's really interesting. And do you think? Do you think that this whole idea of like truth and science and reality, empirical reality, that was kind of the thing for you also? That was the like you said, I just don't have a good answer for this, and I'm interested in truth, and this stuff is just not what truth is. Truth is what I can touch and feel, and that empirical kind of stuff, hard science.
Yeah, the hard science has played a huge role in it. But like I said, I think it was, when I look back over it, and I've been trying to figure this out ever since 2019 when I came back to Christ. I've been trying to figure out exactly what it was that drew me away. And I think just before coming on with you today, I thought to myself, well, what it is just, as I said before, the pride of life. I was I'd grown up in an evangelical world that was also like mixed with my father's agnosticism. And so I had grown up with conventional science, and it was a part of my very being. Growing up with Carl Sagan's Cosmos ringing in your ears, and all of the conventions of science I just had already accepted. I just never really looked at the contradiction between that and what the basic evangelical view of the world was, young earth creation, all of those things. It's like, I just can't make sense of these things. And I began to grow ashamed of that because it didn't seem to stand up to the science, the worldview that was everywhere surrounding this little island of Christianity in which I lived.
Right. Yeah. And so then you go off and you're an atheist for all this time, and eventually you come back to Christianity. And would you say that what ended up defeating your atheism is almost in some sense kind of a similar sort of just like change of worldview, in the sense that God started affecting your or the idea of God, or however you want to put that, started affecting the way you're seeing the world, kind of in the same way, to where you're just like, actually, yeah, there is a God.
Yeah.
Like, was it that kind of thing to coming back? Not a particular argument, not a particular line or sentence, or this kind of thing. It was just the sensus divinitatis kind of thing.
So actually, it was kind of the same process in reverse, although it was a more extended process this time. The trip back to God was much longer, and much more highly rationalized on each step. And so I started teaching philosophy after I got my PhD, and I began to do an awful lot because I was teaching at the Westchester University. No. I was teaching at East Stroudsburg University of Pennsylvania. And I got tasked with, as the adjunct faculty member, almost all of or a large number of the incoming Intro to Philosophy courses. And so, being who I am, when I do something, I end up jumping in with both feet. And so I taught Intro to Philosophy like 4 or 5 times each semester for several years. And in the process, I started really polishing my course. And the course really was very heavily weighted to studying Plato and Socrates together, with an earlier sort of survey of Western philosophy. But it was intensely driven by a study of Plato and Socrates. And I started out loving Plato, and hating Socrates. And by the end of my time of teaching, around 2013 or so, after having taught this many years, the positions had somewhat reversed. And I have respect for both philosophers, but I began to understand that Socrates' vision of human beings as fundamentally ignorant creatures who will never attain the knowledge and the certainty that they're looking for, and should always be cautious in thinking that they have, won the day for me. And so moving forward from there, I had that fundamental lesson, which is essentially the lesson of the Bible. The beginning of the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's like the same message, but it's in Greek philosophical terms as opposed to the biblical terms. And so moving forward from there, as the years passed, I continued to teach online because at around 2013, some events happened that made me stop teaching full-time at a bricks and mortar university. I continued to teach online, but that same message kept resonating with me more and more. And as I began to look at things more closely, I came to the conclusion that ultimately I'm stuck back in that wood between the worlds, because atheism just didn't seem to deliver on its promise. And that's what took me away from Christianity way back when I left. And so I'm left at the end kind of looking at both of them and saying, I can give you a rational story for either one of these, Christianity, theism, or atheism. I can tell you a story that makes sense of all of it. Now what do I do? And ultimately what I did was what God directed. He brought someone into my life, my wife now, that was a strong Christian. And I looked at her and I began to realize she has what I have abandoned. And I needed to see that. And I often say that what happened was I became re-enchanted. That is, I was willing now to look beyond the standard worldview that was anchored in the idea that there is no such thing as the supernatural. And I began to entertain that possibility again. And I mean, if you've heard my other interviews, you know the rest of the story, but that's kind of where it happened and how it happened.
Yeah. Then you jumped into the Christianity pool. And is it something about atheism, there's really nowhere you can go with it in terms of, I guess all you can really say is, I don't know. And, that, I suppose that's fine. But it's really not an answer for, there's no answer for anything. It's just this, supposedly it's a lack of belief, which seems obviously absurd, I think, to anybody who's, sees it's like, how is that even possible to lack a belief?
Yeah, it's not. You can't live as a human being lacking belief in anything. It's just not possible.
Right. And then I heard you say, of course, okay, well, agnosticism, that's the only truly defensible position. And so I think that's where a lot of people kind of end up saying, or maybe somebody who is an atheist probably ends up saying, well, look, I just don't know. Maybe God exists, but there's nothing that can tell me that God does exist. So, and then, implicitly they sort of take the position that God doesn't exist. I think there's really no way out there. At least I don't see how there's a way out. If you're an agnostic, you kind of are an atheist in the sense that you don't believe in God. Obviously if you buy into this whole, non-belief thing, then that might be a bit different. But, and then there's this question of the hyper rationality of this whole position, which I heard you mention that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts more on the idea of hyper rationality and being sort of obsessed with, not that facts and rationality are a bad thing at all. Of course, these are amazing, incredible tools, and I don't think anybody really disagrees with that. Any Christian or theist of any sort, I don't think disagrees with that at all. A lot of them there's tons of mathematicians and scientists and, people who believe in God. But so I'd love to hear, just more of your take on this hyper rationality and obsession with, I need hard proof, man.
Yeah. Yeah, the hyper rationality thing has it's loomed larger and larger for me because I see it clearly anchored in the biblical text. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. You don't come to that conclusion naturally. You have to rationalize yourself to that position. That there is no God doesn't exist in human culture. And I don't need to defend that. Look at history. Show me a culture, and there may be one small isolated culture, I've looked at this before, that doesn't seem to have that sense. But if you look at some of the psychological literature, there is a paper done by a woman some years ago that talks about intuitive theism, that children naturally, even in cultures that, like a Buddhist culture that doesn't believe in an explicit supernatural deity, still have that sense of theism in their very makeup. The children actually defer to a creator when they look at natural phenomena. And that's exactly what it says in Romans 1, too. What Paul says look, what is evident of God is clear to them. He has put it into their being. And this is also something that tripped me up when I was working on my dissertation and studying Jean-Paul Sartre's Being in Nothingness so intensively. Because Sartre was, at the time that he wrote Being in Nothingness, an atheist and promoted atheism strongly. One of the, as a friend of mine calls Sartre, one of the fathers of atheism in the 20th century. And yet you get to the end of Being in Nothingness, and he's got this, after, a stunning 800 pages of phenomenological investigation, you get to the end of it, and he says, inherent in every human being is this notion of the in itself for itself. That is the being that grounds being within itself. That being that is a conscious being that is also the ground of being. And Sartre says it's an empty category, but it's a category that is inherent in human rationality itself. You can't escape it. You can deny it, but you can't escape it. And it troubled me when I read it, of course, because I was an atheist. And it's like, wait a second, you're admitting a lot here, Sartre, when you say this. And yet I couldn't escape it either.
And is that basically, just to understand exactly what he's saying there, because I think it's super interesting, is that after all of this, like you said, this whole, book and treatise on rationality, and I guess essentially what you're saying is essentially atheism. What he's saying there is that, okay, it's undeniable that there is something that is underneath all of our human experience that is like capital B being, which is like Heideggerian, basically, right? Because he was he was coming in the school of Heidegger, right? In a way.
He was influenced by Heidegger a little bit, mostly by Husserl, Edmund Husserl.
Okay, right. And I mean, at the bottom of all of that philosophy basically is God. I mean, you can call it what you want, but capital B being is God. So is that his justification then for everything? He's saying, all right, all of this being what it is, you have to have some way to justify this stuff. Otherwise, it's incoherent. And so I'm justifying it in this. Is that what he's saying? Or maybe you could just explain that a bit.
Yeah, Sartre's essential project, as I see it, was an opposition to the Hegelian project to reduce everything to this sort of immanent spirit that pervades the world and has produced the world. Sartre called his project, now you say these words, but a return to contingency. That is the idea that some things are just discovered and cannot be fully rationally justified. You can adopt a position towards it that seeks to rationally justify it, but that's what he considered metaphysics. And so you can choose to explain away the evidence of God that we find in our being, or you can choose to embrace it. So you have faith and you have atheism. And at one point when I was researching my dissertation, I came across a paper that almost nobody reads by Sartre, in which he essentially said, atheism is faith. And that rocked my world when he said it at the time. And I mean, this is what? It would have been like 15 years before I turned back to Christ. But that stuck with me, that this atheist was actually admitting that atheism itself is standing on the same ground that all believers have throughout all of history, whether they're pagan, whether they're Christian. Everyone is standing on a belief system. They accept it and move forward. Now, what I also found fascinating about Sartre was the position of faith was faith in God, some sort of theism, was immediately for him evident in the study of consciousness. That is, human beings, because they are rational beings, believe in God. And that doesn't mean that you've taken this, and we're going to talk about this later from your notes, we're going to get there. But it doesn't mean that you've, accepted Christ. It doesn't mean that you've really accepted, in terms of biblical faith, the existence of a God. But it does mean that your actions are predicated on some sense of a supernatural that lays beyond our immediate experience. And atheism, especially the atheism and the materialistic science that we deal with today, is predicated on a different viewpoint. It denies what is evident to all of humanity. And that seems pretty important to me.
Right. And when you're saying it denies what, and you're talking about sort of like the rationalistic enterprise, for lack of a better term.
Right.
Or empiricism maybe is a better way to put it, because it's not that, empirical sort of science. That what they're denying is essentially this consciousness, basically, right? Is that right? What's coming from this philosophy? Okay, so
yep. And that's Sartre's point. I mean, he had his whole point in Being and Nothingness is really to establish the distinction between these two radical realms of being. And you can call it a Cartesian dualism if you like, but there's the for itself and there's the in itself. And the two, in terms of consciousness, are radically separate. You can't join them. You can't make sense of them at the terms of lived experience. You can metaphysically account for them. You can tell a story about how one bleeds into the other, right? The theistic story says there's God and then there's created beings, and we're of the latter case. And God created consciousness, that's the spark of the divine inside of us, and so we partake of the divine nature. But on the other side, the atheist side, you can develop a good story too, right? All there is material reality. And then consciousness is an emergent phenomenon. It just comes out of that. How you explain that, like Nagel and others, he's like, it's not really holding up for me, your metaphysics.
Right, yeah. And so maybe this is a good time to ask about sort of, I suppose it would be the denial of certain things. Actually, just before I got on this, I mean, I have so many thoughts right now, but just before I got on this call, I was watching this video, and this atheist was like reviewing videos from theists, and she was talking about the watchmaker argument, and somebody said, oh, well, I have this meal here, and obviously it was made by a chef. And the atheist says in response to that, well, I can just go look in the kitchen, and obviously there's all this evidence from where this food came from, but God, there's no evidence. And I was sitting there thinking, it is so ridiculous, like, look around. Are you kidding me? Like, there's so much evidence for like consciousness, all of these experiences, the fact that there's anything at all, all of that actually, that is the evidence, right? And it's sort of blows my mind actually that, I mean, you don't have to accept that, but at least you have to acknowledge that, okay, yeah, that actually is evidence for some. I don't know what it is, but there's something going on, man. Like, and that's Nagel, right? Nagel doesn't want God to exist. He's very clear about that.
And even Antony Flew.
Who's that?
Antony Flew, famous 20th century atheist. And right before he died, like 10 years before he died, he wrote a book, There Is a God. And he came to the same conclusion. He said, all that I denied before, I look at now and I understand it to be evidence for a God.
Right. So that's kind of like an acceptance of, like, Nagel denies in the first like couple pages in the intro to his Mind and Cosmos, he denies, or he just says, yeah, I don't have the sensus divinitatis. So right out of the gate, I'm saying I'm not really entertaining theism as a legitimate option. but I am saying that material science has no way to account for. He even says, the origin of life, consciousness. I mean, it's just completely insufficient. And then he goes on to, build that case on and on. And he doesn't really provide anything. I mean, he says right at the outset, he doesn't really provide any viable alternative, just that materialism isn't sufficient to explain these other things, and that it's an outright denial of it. And so is the way around that philosophy, from Sartre and these things, that I guess it's sort of the categorical stuff from Kant. It's a similar kind of idea, right? That there's these things in themselves that we just can't talk about. But we can talk about them, obviously, because we're talking about them.
Right.
And is the way around that? What's your way around that in terms of believing in God? Is it the sensus divinitatis? Is it something like that? Or what's your sort of philosophical kind of rationale for kind of against that position?
Okay. Can you clarify a little bit what it is I'm defending against?
Yeah. So that, like the stuff that you were just talking about, Sartre and Kant, and the idea that, okay, maybe there is some sort of grounding, but I have no way of talking about that. I have no way of even getting to talk about that. Yeah, that thing of whatever it may be. I can't even talk about it. So
okay, this gets us into something that you have later in your notes. So if you don't mind my jumping ahead a little.
Yeah, no, totally fine. Yeah.
So while I was teaching Plato and Socrates back in my first few years as a professor, I kept stumbling across this one passage in Plato's Phaedo. And let me just read it just to get it out there.
Please, that would be great.
So someone's speaking with Socrates, I think it's Simmias. He says, "I think, Socrates, as perhaps you do yourself, that it is either impossible or very difficult to acquire clear knowledge about these matters in this life." Now there's Kant, right? He says there are certain realities that we can't plumb the depths of, right? And what are we going to do with those things? Okay, so Simmias continues. And yet, and this should give us a throwback, a reminiscence of what I said about C.S. Lewis's Magician's Nephew and The Wood Between the Worlds, right? And yet, he is a weakling who does not test in every way what is said about them and persevere until he is worn out by studying them on every side. In other words, if you stay in your agnosticism, if you just stay there where Kant says, here we are, we can't figure it out, alas, poor me, you're never going to move forward, right? And by common consent in human rationality, the question of whether or not God exists is not a small issue, right? Everything depends on it. And so we continue. For he must do one of two things. Either he must learn or discover the truth about these matters. That is, continue the investigation until you get to the bottom of it. Or, if that is impossible, he must take whatever human doctrine is best and hardest to disprove, and, embarking upon it as upon a raft, sail upon it through life in the midst of dangers. So you're stuck. This is what the existentialist called thrownness. You're in life. You're a human being. All kinds of things are coming at you all the time. And you can't just sit there and not decide. You've got to take a position and then move forward. If you made the wrong decision, you bear the consequences of that, and hopefully you make a better decision next time. But you can't just sit there. That's cowardly, he says here. And then I love what comes next. Unless he can sail upon some stronger vessel, some divine revelation, and make his voyage more safely and securely. And so, as human beings, we go back to the point that Socrates made. We're fundamentally limited, ignorant creatures. There's only so much we're ever going to get. As Isaiah said of God, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts, and my ways are higher than your ways. So where is the divine revelation that Plato was looking for? It had already mostly been written by that time by the Jews, the Old Testament. So the divine revelation that is a surer raft is the Bible. And I couldn't escape that opinion. And it's become ever more clear to me since 2019 when I came back to Christ. The Bible keeps proving itself to me over and over and over again.
That's an incredible passage. Very beautiful as well. That must have played a role of, that's a significant sort of milestone for you, right?
Oh man, it was huge because I kept having to trip over it every year, 4, 5, 6, probably like 8, 9, 10 times every year as I taught this course. I had to read that passage to the students and say, this is what it's saying. So faith isn't just, the intuitive theism. It's clear I see around me the evidence of a God who's created all of this. It's actually stepping out on that and sailing on it.
Right. Yeah. So that's what faith is. That's a very confronting passage, of course, because like you said, it's confronting someone who's unwilling to make a decision, or maybe someone also, may not be ready to make a certain decision or something, to be fair as well. But it is very confronting. It's like, okay, what am I going to do here? Because there's these unanswered questions and there's these different options that I'm aware of. And, at some point I'm going to have to make a decision. And so like a lot of people would say to that, well, science is going to give me an answer eventually to consciousness and to these things. So at some point in the future, like I have a really good friend of mine who's a brilliant computer programmer. This is something that he's said to me for years when we're talking about, well, eventually science is going to have an answer. And it's like, what? Like, what are you even talking about? Like, what do you say to that, to someone who says that kind of thing?
I mean, that's one of the options available to someone who is just relying on their human reason. It's exactly what Plato says. I come to that juncture and I have to make a choice. You make that choice, but remember, there are consequences for every choice that you make in life. And ignoring evidence on this side because it's inconvenient to the choice that you made over here is very dangerous. And so what I usually say to atheists is try to be skeptical about where you're standing now, because it has become a new orthodoxy that has pervaded our culture to the extent that it's not even allowed to be questioned. I mean, I lived in academia for a lot of years, and trust me, if you express those opinions in academia, forget it. You're persona non grata. Yeah. And so, I mean, it's become so pervasive that it's like the strictest level of ostracism within the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. Right? These people doubt what we're saying. They must be killed. Yeah. And they commit. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just go ahead. And they commit. What is it? They commit murder on people's ways of living. Right there. I'm trying to think of the name of when you're professional. They commit professional murder on many people who believe. So most of us have learned to keep our mouths shut.
Right. Yeah. And I know. Yeah. And you sort of talked about that quote unquote fundies kind of term as almost a derogatory sort of like insult. And there is sort of a sense of, I mean, of course, there's always arrogance, senses of arrogance on both sides of any issue. But I do really get a sense when I engage myself in the atheist arguments, or whatever you want to call that. There's this like, how could you be so dumb to not take this position? Like, this is so foolish. I mean, this is like you have an imaginary friend or something like that. But now, I mean, that seems just like such a silly response to me now. That, but it's very common, isn't it? Like like, do you have any great memories of, or do you have any? I'm I'm curious if you've had any really memorable conversations with either an atheist when you're a Christian or a Christian when you were an atheist. Any sort of highlights that you can remember? I'd love to hear about those.
Yeah, since coming back, there's one particular atheist I engaged quite extensively. I think it was on YouTube. Remember the guy? He was. This is one of the thing that trips me up all the time with atheists. They don't want to believe that they have faith in anything. And so this guy made the best case of anyone in the atheist community that he didn't have faith. And he based it all on statistics, right? I go with the statistics. I follow the statistics. And so probability is what makes me decide things. It's not a matter of believing one thing or another. But of course, probability still isn't decision, right? You still have to look at the probabilities and say, okay, this is more probable than this, and therefore I'm going to go with this. And then you do something like I did, like last year. I read a celebrated evolutionist, Eugene Koonin, who wrote a book called The Logic of Chance. And in it, Koonin himself calculated the probability of two of the necessary elements of life beginning on Earth. Just two, and there's a whole host more. Two of these things coming into existence at the same time. It was something like the repair mechanism for DNA, and what else? One of the other, the ribosome or something like that. Those two necessary elements for life to begin, so that evolution could begin. And his calculation was, and remember, he's an evolutionist, that it's one chance in 10 to the 1016. 1016. Now there are 10 to the 80 elementary particles in our universe. Elementary particles in our entire universe. That's the calculation. And so this is like so many factors bigger than that Koonin's answer to the question of how he continues to believe in evolution is that there must be an infinity of universes, right? So this is the multiverse thing. And we just happen to be in that one that had all of those things come together so that, and this is the anthropic principle, so that we find ourselves here on this planet Earth alive and having been the products of evolution. So he refused to abandon the evolutionary view, despite its absolute improbability. I mean, statistically impossible. And yet he holds on to it. And so who's exercising more faith in a situation?
Yeah. Yeah, with the multiverse thing. Yeah. Yeah, it all gets kind of crazy, like these sorts of justification. I mean, it's very like fascinating what, you have to come up with in order to justify all sorts of things. Like, at that point, I mean, basically you're talking about God, pretty much. I mean, in some way or another, right?
Yep.
And that's another very common argument that I see is, I mean, something that's become more popular online for whatever reason is the ontological argument.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that to be a very compelling argument, actually. And I think that the main response to it is you can do it with anything. The island response to that.
Yeah.
But the further you go with that, I mean, anything that you propose to be greater, it has to exist greater in reality than it's great. Eventually you just get to God again. So it's exactly. Like that island will just become God, right?
Yeah.
But people propose these arguments as if they're legitimate defeaters. But it just goes they don't really go anywhere. None of these objections go anywhere because at the bottom you have to justify existence somehow.
Yeah, and you have to justify why you should trust your reason in the first place if there's no ground for trusting your reason. I mean, if we are just these cosmic accidents that came about as the result of all these things by chance coming together, and I know, Dawkins will say, it's not by chance, it's natural selection is not chance. Whatever. It started somewhere, and that was chance. So in any way, if you've already bought that argument then none of the arguments for the existence of God are going to mean a thing to you. And that's
Yeah,
why
exactly.
I say early in the Christian Atheist, I said, I wasn't convinced by any of the arguments for God. I could look at them and say, okay, that's interesting. And it has a certain, intellectual appeal. But even now as a Christian, I can look at the arguments for evolution. And I know there are theistic evolutionists. I used to be one up until last year, and say, this is compelling. It makes sense. I just read Dawkins's Blind Watchmaker. And as I work my way through it, you look at these individual things and you think, yeah, that's plausible. I get it. Makes sense. And then you have to sort of pull back and say, okay, but what lies behind these arguments?
Right, exactly. And the whole evolutionary argument against naturalism, as it comes down to what you were saying before about, what's your basis for trusting your rationality and so on. I think that argument is super compelling. I just don't think a lot of people really get it, because the response to that argument is like, what are you talking about? I think.
Exactly.
Duh. So, what are you even talking about? Like, yeah, I can think, obviously. So I'm making these decisions and I can trust my beliefs, but like, that's the whole point. Like when I've watched those lectures from Planting, there's one where all these students are asking him questions at the end. It's like nobody understood the argument.
Yeah,
not one person got what he was actually saying.
Yeah.
And they just dismiss it out of hand. But, are you really considering what is being said here?
Yeah, C.S. Lewis said something very similar to what you just said there in his essay, The Funeral of a Great Myth. And he said, the fact that no one of educated opinion today can see the problem is evidence of how deep the hole is in their belief system. And that's exactly right. They just refuse to see it.
Yeah, you essentially what they're doing is just justifying by saying, well, I have reason, therefore I can think, therefore I have reason. And it's like, that's not a justification, right? It's not. Right. And then if you say to that, like if a theist would say, well, God is the explanation, then they just accuse the theist of having that's a circular argument. But there has to be something at the bottom of everything. And that's always going to be self-referential, right?
Yep. It's got to be circular. It's got to start somewhere. And the start's going to have to be justifying itself. And that's Sartre's idea of the in itself for itself.
Right, exactly. So it comes back to that. So I just want to circle back to something that you were saying before, which in and of itself was really interesting, about how children sort of have this natural psychological predisposition to a belief in God, or just this natural sense, which maybe that's evidence for a sensus divinitatis that is kind of intact and like functioning properly. As far as that goes, I want to get your thoughts on basically the idea of God, other paths to God, perennialism, that whole thing where God comes in is are there multiple paths to God? And what's your thought on that, and why not?
Yeah, I have to come back to, for me, what is the anchor? And I think it has to be the anchor, because rationalism itself is merely a form. That is, you have to believe something first and then see what follows. The idea of a fallacy is what we call a non sequitur. And in Latin, that just means it doesn't follow. And so you have to have something from which to follow to even begin the process of reason. Credo ut intelligam. I believe in order that I may know. So what are we going to believe? Well, if we go back to the Plato quote, it's either something we've rationalized or it's some divine revelation. And so if we start with exactly where Genesis starts, in the beginning, God, and we start reasoning from there, continuing to sail on the raft of revelation, that is what God has told us, then maybe we can get somewhere. And look, I spent my first years in my life as a Christian who I think never really did that. And it wasn't until 2019, when I turned back to Christ, that I began to take that seriously and say, okay, I'm going to believe what the Bible says and what God says. And I didn't realize how radically, even at that point, I wasn't doing it. But the more I have done that in the 6 years since then, the more confirmed has been the truth of God's word in my life. What God says matters. What people say, not so much. And so I just keep going back to if you're basing things on just your human reason, then you've got no solid ground from which to reason. And that's not because I like everything I find in the Bible. And this is one of the arguments that you wanted to confront. So maybe I'll bring it up here. You said so many atheists will say something, oh, you just want to believe that. Trust me, there's a lot in the Bible I don't want to believe. I don't want to believe in the doctrine of hell. I don't want to believe that a loving God would actually prepare eternal punishment for others. I don't want to believe that. I don't have a choice. Because if God is God, then he gets the right to tell me what the truth is. And so I've got to bow to the authority. We say we're a scientific culture. What does that mean? It means that when we investigate things, we come to the base of reality, and reality tells us how we have to correct our theories about it. It's no different with God. We have to come to God and say, okay, you tell us what reality is, and we're going to try to move forward on that basis. And then as Paul says in the New Testament, God will correct you as things proceed. And so that's kind of where I am now, and where Jenny and I are as we try to move forward in this vale of tears in which we live.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess that is really the most reasonable response to, you want to believe in God because it's a comforting thing and life sucks, and that's the argument that I find most sort of like, it's very almost like it's very funny from the atheist. I think you just want to have comfort, you just want to have there is no meaning, man. Just deal with it. Okay. I have courage as the atheist because I accept that there's no meaning. And despite that fact, I'm going out, I'm helping people's lives. I'm caring about my family. But there is no meaning. Like if there is no God, there is no meaning then. Yeah. If it's all just random and then they say, wow, that doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that there's ultimate meaning. I have meaning right now in this moment because I'm a conscious being. I have meaning. You don't, though.
No. Unless God gave you a reason to have meaning, you wouldn't have meaning.
Right.
And why would you value anything?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what I don't understand about that, or how someone doesn't see that. Because you can see, even if you're an atheist, you just bite the bullet on that and just say, yeah, you're right. It is ultimately all meaningless, and I'm just living in my own delusion. That would be the honest answer.
That was Sarah's answer.
Right.
That's one of the reasons I respected him as an atheist. He actually said, yep, there is no, you've got to create your own.
Yeah, and total delusion.
That has no basis.
Exactly. Even if you create your own, it's still just a delusion. You're still just living in a meaningless delusion, ultimately, because there is no meaning. And something that I don't think a lot of these people even think about, because for a while I thought, maybe there's something to this argument, But then I think about all of the people in the world who they don't have anybody to care about. They don't have anything.
Care for them. Yeah.
Exactly. Or to care for them. They don't actually have any of that even in this moment. And so what's that saying to those people as well? You're not considering that. Mm-hmm. So they have no meaning, period, those people. So, that would be a defeater to that, I think, in a way, because they don't even have momentary meaning. So,
and we can turn the argument around on them, right? They don't believe in God because it's comforting for them not to believe in God.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
I can share that from a very prominent atheist. Is it all right if I read a little bit from Nagel?
Yeah, no, please. Yeah, please go ahead.
So at the end of Nagel's book, The Last Word, which is absolutely fantastic. It's a great book. Nagel says this: I speak from experience, being strongly subject to this fear, that is, fear of God and judgment, this fear myself. I want atheism to be true. and am made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God, and naturally, hope that I'm right in my belief. And there's Plato's raft, right? It's that I hope there is no God! Exclamation point. And if you read philosophy much, philosophers don't use exclamation points, but he uses one here. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. Now, if that's not wish fulfillment, I don't know what is.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the whole Freudian argument. Yeah, which is just an assumption in itself anyway, right? That whole thing.
Yep.
He just assumes that God is false and then says it's this wish fulfillment thing. Yeah, and yeah, turning that around is quite easy. That's a great passage from Nagel.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very, very revealing of that position.
He's
so yeah,
uneasy himself.
Yeah, yeah. And I find it incredible that he basically makes the case for God. I mean, he makes the case for God. At least he's honest about reductive materialism, naturalism.
Yep.
He's honest about that. So it's a great book for any of Nagel's stuff. Is great to read for anybody, I think, who is thinking about this stuff at all from any perspective. It's great stuff to read because it can open your mind to the reality of the current state of science and whatnot.
Yeah. Whenever I pick up something by him, I pray for the man because he's so close. And I wonder whether or not, what's his name? Antony Flew, at the end of his life, actually found the Lord. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that some of them close to him were trying. I don't know. You don't know what's the end of one's life is. It's always between God and them.
And yeah, exactly. It's all right, precisely. Just to go back to the whole question of perennialism and the do you think it's possible that people are seeing God through a different lens? And I'm not saying that maybe someone doesn't have access to the Bible or whatever. There's arguments for that and there's justifications for that, which is actually kind of what you just said, actually. That ultimately everybody has a relationship to God, and so at the final analysis is it's between the individual and God. But somebody who may have let's say like a very similar sort of theology or understanding of God that's found in the Bible, but that's not from the Bible, and essentially let's say they met up with a Christian and they were talking about. Either one of them may not know we're talking about the same God, like that level of similarity of understanding. Like, what's your take on that?
It kind of reminds me of one of the other questions you talked about. One God further.
That whole argument, which also just seems. Yeah, Ricky Gervais famously did that on the Colbert Report. I think where he's I just believe in one less God than everybody else, and it's a compelling argument. Sort of just when you first hear it, it's like, oh man, that's actually really good. But then the more you think about it, it just seems kind of silly. Also,
it is silly. It falls apart. It's like saying, let's see, you got two scientists who are trying to parse out how to set up the notion of trees. What is a tree and what is not a tree? And they go out into the woods and one says, this is a tree and this is a tree and this is a tree and this is a tree. And the other one says, no, that's not a tree. That's a bush. And that's not a tree. That's a bush. And this is a climbing vine. That's not a tree. And so there are no trees. That's the argument. So no, you're not getting rid of the category by dismissing individual elements within it. So it's just it's a silly argument. And Dawkins should have known better.
Yeah, because God is God.
Yeah.
So obviously, saying you believe in one less God than all these other, it's just a category error.
But by dismissing, as a Christian, I look and I say, Moloch may have been a supernatural being. I don't know that for sure. That's one way of reading these false, what we call false gods, these idols. That there actually are supernatural beings. But when you say I deny Moloch or I deny all these other Zeus and Thor. I'm denying that they're God. I'm not,
Yes.
it's not like you can't dismiss individuals and still say, but there is a category that fits. And
Right.
so, it's a
Yeah,
silly
precisely.
argument. And I'm not sure if
Yeah.
I actually came back and answered the question you put to me.
Yeah, no, that's sort of along the same lines, I guess, ultimately, because it's what it comes down to is this question of, God, who's the source of all. The definition of God would be something like, just the source of everything, period, the flat out, outside space and time, all of that. Um, and so not making that same sort of category error, and that, okay, well, you're just worshiping some deity or something like that, or an angel or whatever the case may be, because of course in this broader worldview, that is not restricted to materialist naturalistic stuff, of course there's the reality of supernatural entities and so on. That's not anything that's completely feasible and normal in something that goes beyond naturalism. But the question of God, and sort of what I'm interested in, is if somebody is coming to a very similar conclusion about the person of God, a personal God, the source of everything, the first cause, all of these, the supreme controller, the sustainer of the universe, all of these sorts of qualities that we have come to know about God through various revealed scriptures,
Many paths. I get it. I remember now. Many paths.
Many paths. So if someone's coming to God in sort of a way that is, different from someone else, but they are actually in fact landing at the same place. What's your thought on that?
If the same place is Christ, then
right.
But I don't get, again, it's going back to that same thing. I don't get to choose. God does. And I think to myself, as a Christian, I think, well, I don't understand really how God deals with all of these other people. But back in the Old Testament, when God's about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, he says, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? So ultimately, if I'm believing in God, he's the God of the universe who is just and will do everything right. And therefore, if I believe in the word that he gave us, and he tells me there is one path, one, Christ.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's the only thing I've got to go on. And therefore, that's what I have to believe. Do I like it? No, not necessarily. I would love to think to myself, you're practicing this religion and it's okay because it took you to God. I can't. I would like to. I can't.
None come to the Father but through me.
Right.
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, that makes perfect sense. But what if someone was coming from the Christian perspective? What if someone was coming to God through Christ, but it wasn't that name or something like that? Like, what if it's the same essential passageway, so to speak, but it's just a different name kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like in that final analysis kind of way.
So my thoughts are higher than your thoughts and my ways than your ways. The only thing I have to go on is the word that he gave me. And so when I come to someone who has, I'm thinking of somebody in particular here, they think that they've come to God, but they haven't come directly through Jesus by faith.
Mm-hmm.
Their actual relationship to God, I don't know. But what they objectively tell me says to me, they haven't come. And so I have to treat them as the Bible teaches me to treat them and give them the gospel.
Right. Yeah.
Because it's Jesus. And however God works it out, I know he's going to be just. And I don't understand all of it, but I have to understand what he's given and follow that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That's that's what I understand most. That's basically the Christian perspective. Although another thing that interests me sort of just theologically is I've been reading Van Til's Christian Apologetics just out of interest. Great book, actually. Great, interesting guy. There's all these different views, like even in Christianity, in terms of, all the theological sort of stuff. And something that I was reading about the other day, actually, which I found interesting. I'd love to get your opinion on this, is the origin of the soul. And what there's a few different interesting opinions. I mean, I was reading Saint Maximus, and I was reading about what his sort of take on it was about, the soul and the body are created at the same time. And then I was reading about Origen, and the soul was always at rest with God, and then eventually came down to earth and took on a body kind of idea. What's your take on that sort of theological difference of opinion?
If I can answer one other thing first.
Yeah, please, anything.
I am worried right now, and I'm coming from a philosophical background.
Yeah.
Having come back to Christ, having completely rejected it for 25 years. And I'm coming back into the Christian world in a way that I've never been in it before, for a long time. And I'm talking with various people, and there is this sort of rise of an intellectualism within Christianity that troubles me. And I think we're sort of starting to make an idol of our ability to make sense of God. And that worries me, because we're not going to make sense of God. Ultimately, God is the origin of sense. We must accept him first and then begin to reason. And otherwise, we're reasoning on a false basis. And so part of, I think, for Jenny and I moving forward in our ministry, what we want to do is, this is hard for me to say because I'm a philosopher, and that's what I've imbibed all my life, this rational process that leads us to truth. But that's not sufficient. If God's word, if the Bible, I can even go farther back than that. If God is who he says he is, and the word of God is his divine revelation, as Plato talked about it in that passage, then that's what we've got to go on and trust. And I think we would do better as Christians to not abandon. I find great value in the church fathers, in the history, in all of those things, the traditions. They're all valuable and worthwhile, but they're not the ultimate value. And I think we would do better as Christians to spend more time in our Bible. And this is hard for me to say, because when I was a Christian back in Bible college, it's like, that's work. I don't like reading the Bible. It's boring. But it's not boring. Since I came back, and I can't tell you exactly how it came about. God must have been working. But I live to read the Bible now. And it is what has intellectually fulfilled me at a level that philosophy never did, or even the study of history. And I love that stuff. I love it. But I think sometimes we get too caught up in the different arguments and the different things, and we would serve better to go back to the word, not neglect those other things. But
I think that's a great perspective. That's a really interesting answer, because and I think that is sort of the truly sort of spiritual answer to, obviously with these intellectual questions, we can go to, it goes on, there's no end. Because
like Solomon said, of the writing of books, there is no end.
Right. Yeah, precisely. Yeah. And we'll never fully understand is basically, I mean, that's what I hear you saying, is that, ultimately we can't understand fully because we're finite beings, and we're trying to ultimately understand the infinite. It's just not going to happen. So at a certain point, don't go too far into thinking about, these things, because you're just going to get kind of caught in this
a feedback
web.
loop.
Is that kind of what you're
getting at there? We get caught in this feedback loop, and we forget that coming to God is not about information or reasoning. It's about knowing a person. And I guess that's what shifted in my thinking in the last 6 years. It's like, I'm not seeking to know anymore, except God, just him. I want to know God. Just like Paul said, I forget which book it is. I want to know God, the power of his, and I'm sorry, I'm losing the verse, but it's like, that's what I live for, to know my Lord. And there's only one place to really do that well.
Yeah, that's a really great perspective. Yeah, like I said, I think that's ultimately the spiritual perspective, that you're developing that relationship. Like what you're saying is you're developing a relationship with God. Which, would you say that is essentially, you can't express that? Would you say that's accurate? That it's something that you has constellated within you, and it's sort of, whatever it is, it's known by you, and maybe the degree to which you could possibly express or communicate this to someone else would be through art or something like that, or poetry or literature, or
yeah, sort of. I mean, I think that's exactly what the writers of the Bible were involved with. It's like they wanted to express the knowledge of God that had been impressed upon them in an objective way. And that's not an easy task. So it's good he's helping. But Lewis says something like this too. He says, look, if you're looking to talk about God in terms of a scientific language, you're going to have to distort it. So instead, we're going to talk about God in a more poetic, metaphorical way, because God isn't subject to those scientific constraints, those boxes that we draw that delineate things so carefully. God is much more of, what does he say? His spirit bearing witness to our spirit. And I don't mean subjectivism there, because it's an objective reality. In that sense, I think God is the ultimate objectivity, and what we see around us, what we experience, is much more shadowlandy.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, sorry. I would like to do better with that.
No, that's, I think that's beautiful. I think that is a really, that's a perspective that I've been thinking about a lot lately, just in my own sort of, considering all of these different things and these different perspectives, and trying to, think about, like, how do you even talk about these things to other people? How do you even have conversations about this stuff? And I think that that's something that is, when it's almost, I've almost started thinking that, is it even possible for someone, and maybe two people don't have the exact same conception of God, or something like that, even maybe two Christians or anything like that, but at least they can have a conversation, and there's an understanding there. There's sort of an implicit understanding, because maybe they're going through a similar process with their own reckoning. But I don't even know anymore is it even possible to have a conversation with somebody about this sort of stuff, who doesn't believe in God, or some semblance of that idea. Like, is it even possible?
Yeah,
really?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to one of my favorite philosophers, Thomas Kuhn, right? And so this idea of the paradigms, we as human beings have a shared human paradigm. And so we're always, it's the very fact that we're human enables us to have a shared level of experience that we can engage at. And yet below that really broadest paradigm, there are these other levels of thinking. And just like you said, when you've got theism versus an atheistic viewpoint, your ability to connect is radically separated. And that's why, in a sense, since I came back in 2019, I spent like 5 years trying to reason with atheists, developing all of these incredible, what I thought ended up being incredible arguments, and putting them together and spelling them out. I didn't touch a single atheist, I don't think. And yet, this beginning of this year, I think it was, my wife said to me, why don't you stop trying to reason with them and give them God's word? And for the first time, I think I had an atheist absolutely, he was absolutely hostile. And yet, at the end, he ended up deleting his whole text because he knew he's defeated. And so I see God saying, my word will always come back to me, performing what I sent it for. But I never had an atheist once back down from any argument I would throw at them. They would always come back, either ignore what I said and go on with their viewpoint. That's what usually happened. and
Right.
try to make another point. And then I destroy that point, and I destroy another point. But
Yeah.
they would never deal with it. But it didn't change them at all. And so God
Right.
has to do it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Go. No. What were you going to say? Please go ahead.
No, it's just that's what he did with me. It's like when I walked away for 25 years and I came back, it's not like I suddenly said, okay, I've now decided there is a God and I'm going to be a Christian again.
Yeah.
I told people for years, Christians would come up and talk to me about my atheism, and they would say, "Why don't you turn back to God?" He said, "You've reached this point of agnosticism, but why don't you turn back to God?" And I'd say, "I can't. You don't understand. There's like this switch I can't flip." Even though I would sort of like to come back to God with the assurances that the comforts that exist within, despite the problems too that I don't like, but the comforts of believing, I would love to go back there again, but I can't flip the switch. And then suddenly I had a moment in my life again where I was able to flip the switch. And I can't attribute that to my reasoning. It's like God gave me an opportunity.
And yeah, exactly. So it's it's sort of this inexplicable kind of thing that just occurred.
Yeah.
It occurred for you, and so that's something that I've been interested in lately, just in terms of how do people come to believe in God, and or even how do people have a sense of this, and some people just don't at all. Like that's become more and more clear, and I think that what you just articulated is essentially the thing. I mean, you sort of, I guess what you actually did is you didn't necessarily articulate it because it's not something that can actually be articulated, right? But you sort of pointed at this process,
right?
And then the actual moment is not able to be expressed. It's like you said, I get you have to just share the word, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't. Did I read? I'm not sure that I read C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy when I was an atheist or not. I might have, but I've read it since coming back. And his account of his conversion to Christ is so similar to what I experienced, although he uses different metaphors. It's like he says exactly the same thing. And I thought, that's it. And he was kind of baffled by it too. He didn't quite know what to make of it. So that's a common thing, I think, with a lot of this stuff. When you get to this sort of point, it is kind of just baffling. It's a little bit baffling. Mm-hmm. If you were to, one thing I wanted to ask you was, if is there one sort of like Bible verse or one thing that comes to mind that you would share to somebody who had never heard about any of this stuff, or is kind of open to hearing it but didn't look into any of it themselves, but was open to hearing something? Do you have a favorite sort of piece that you would share with somebody like that? You mean a verse or like a book?
Anything that would come to your mind. Doesn't have to be, I mean, just what would you share with somebody like that who doesn't believe in God but's open to hearing?
I think the Gospel of John, enarche en holagas. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's like, wow, what do you do with that? I mean, if you're a literary person, a person who loves the arts and the humanities, as I do, that is like overwhelming. It's like what all is contained in that, especially when you start looking closer and you find out that the word is in Greek logos, which means reason itself. And so in the beginning was reason, was rationality, and rationality was God. And then, back in the Old Testament, one of my favorite is where Moses meets with God, and God says to Moses, "Go tell the Israelites that I am sent you," being itself. And so all of these things that we seem to be searching for coalesce, just like you said earlier in our discussion, seem to coalesce down into an individual, a being that is being, capital B, which is God. And we keep coming back there, whether we want to or not. When we follow the logic and I did as an atheist, that's why I ended up where I was at the end, saying this atheism thing, it's not so hot. I followed the logic of what it was. And I think the reason most people remain atheists is they refuse to follow the logic.
Yeah, right. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's very interesting because even like that John 1, that's John 1, right? The
Yep,
that's
John 1:1. Yep.
and then the last one of that is the light has not been defeated, or I can't remember the
Right,
exact line, but something
right.
like that. That's also, I mean, that whole bit is very, very beautiful. Like, yeah, even just from a literary perspective, I mean, like the stuff is a few weeks ago I read Psalm 23 just out of nowhere, and I was like, man, that is so beautiful. Like,
It
come
is.
on. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't, I mean, you share that with anybody and it's just like, man, that's just incredibly beautiful stuff. It doesn't get any better than that.
You made me happier right there than anything we've talked about since, because I saw the delight in your reading of God's word. That is
Yeah.
what I feel every day. My wife and I
Yeah.
together read passages from the Bible before we go to bed every night. And it's like when I wake up in the morning, I look forward to that moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's a delight.
totally. Yeah, it's incredible. Some of the beauty of that stuff is really untouchable. Um, I wanted to ask you something about John 1. You were saying, yeah, in the beginning was the Word. Um, it's I think it slipped my mind at this point. But yeah, though sharing these things, I suppose that is a good one to share. The John 1 to anybody really. Um, yeah, so yeah, that's my question has slipped my mind there, but there's a couple more things that I do want to talk about that I had notes here anyway, so I'll just go to one of those. Um, when you were in Bible college and you were like studying this stuff, full time, did you like have you ever thought back to those days and thought like about like Christian apologetics and like sort of defending the faith and like doing debates and stuff like have you ever thought about any of that, like doing that, kind of going back to those roots and doing that these days? Or
Yeah, I actually have on YouTube several different. I'm a little embarrassed by them now because I wasn't quite where I am now at the time, but I came back in 2019 and there's several YouTube debates I've had. I guess the one with Tom Jump really sticks out with me. He's a famous YouTube atheist.
oh,
Um,
you did one with Tom Jump, eh?
yeah, yeah. So, and that was a lot of fun. And I think Tom went away really mad at me, but it was fun. And so I do enjoy that. But even when I first came back, I said to Jenny, I don't want to be a Christian apologist. I'll
Uh-huh.
engage anyone. I will argue for the faith. I will give an answer for the hope that is in me. But I don't want to be labeled an apologist because I don't think God needs an apologist in that sense, even though that's the actual word used in that verse.
Yeah.
I, I don't feel as though God needs me to defend him. I think he needs me to present him. He speaks for himself.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the strength of the Christian position, the strength of theism, I find no real powerful arguments or evidence against it. And so I just say, let God be God. And
Right.
he's the one who draws people anyway. So, yeah, I'm happy to do debates. They're fun because
Yeah, yeah.
they don't scare me at all.
Right. Yeah, see that, and that's really I do think, yeah, it's a sort of a double-edged sword with these kind of debates, right? Because on the one hand, what you're saying is yeah, I mean, obviously God doesn't need to be defended, and I totally understand that. On the other hand, for a lot of people, even just like opening people's minds,
Yeah.
hearing these sort of thoughtful debates can be very powerful just in terms of opening somebody's mind, because it's also sort of rare to kind of I feel like it's so common to hear really good arguments for empiricism, naturalism, materialism, so on and so on. But the and there's a lot of sort of like funny stuff from debates that come out from the theistic side, I think, that
Mhm.
that are sort of just funny, like meme whatever stuff. Um, so having powerful defenders of the idea of theism, even just generally, I think does carry a lot of weight. Can open a lot of minds for sure. So that and they're just great conversations to listen to, especially somebody with your background in philosophy who can actually engage meaningfully and sort of on an intellectual level as well.
Yeah. I think
Is go ahead.
I think what I would say about it is, again, I'm not devaluing the apologists or apologetics. I think it's all very important. I think it's incredibly important. In fact, Jenny and I spend a lot of the day reading through different apologetic materials and scientific evidence and all the rest of those things. But I guess it goes back again to me, is that my highest priority, or is knowing God my highest priority? And
of course,
I have to put that above. And it's like, that's what matters to me most.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes total sense. Do you have like when you do a debate, do you have sort of like a main argument that you use or anything like that?
I go in and try to listen to what they have to say, and then try my best, thinking on my feet, which I'm not great at, to come back. And I usually let them drive the discussion.
Cool. That's it. Yeah. That's you're really just, your approach is to just have an open conversation, basically, and yeah,
Socratic.
That's great. I think we need more sort of conversations that are just conversations. I think online, from what I see, there's a lot of just kind of like blood sport stuff. So it's nice to have honest engagement, which is clearly what your approach would be, which I think is great. So I'm definitely gonna go check out your past debates, because I'm very curious to see those, and anybody else should go check them out as well. The last thing that we haven't covered here that I'm interested to hear your take on is the whole question of evil in the world. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about the last week or so. Actually, I've been thinking about it, and sort of its status. How it comes into our lives, how it manifests for different people, even, like why people are, something I've always been fascinated about. It's like, why do people love horror movies and stuff like that?
Yeah.
So maybe you could just give me your thoughts on sort of that generally.
Yeah. Well, it seems as though the story in Genesis of creation does present, and this is following on the actual words of the questions you sent me, it does seem to me that evil is simply the privation of good, just like darkness is the privation of light. And so it has no independent existence. I did a book on Paradise Lost, called Paradise Lost, The Machinery of Evil. It's available on Amazon. And Jenny and I went through it very meticulously and tried to develop an understanding of the nature of evil through Paradise Lost in relation to Scripture. And I loved that study. It's actually all available on our podcast as well. It's a little bit modified and a little bit strengthened in the book, but essentially it's the podcast that we did in going through the various books of Paradise Lost by Milton. And I do believe that it is just the privation of good. Otherwise, how could God have said in the beginning, and he saw all that he had created, and behold, it was very good. And so what was added by evil? Nothing. Something was taken away. Something was obscured. And that seems to me to be the best answer for evil. Do I know? No, but that seems to be the best thing to hold on to, given what the scriptures seem to say.
Right. Just the corruption, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, what's your opinion culturally on sort of the current cultural state of I guess pop culture, because that's kind of the mainstream feed?
Boy, that's a big question.
I mean, there's a lot of darkness, I guess, right? I mean, from what I see, well, I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
I don't understand why God continues to forbear and allow us to go on. He talked about destroying the Canaanite civilization and the Phoenicians with their child sacrifice. And I think we've actually taken it a step beyond. At least their children were born before they sent them into the fire. We do it in the quiet places where no one can see. And so I think our culture has declined to an extent that I just don't understand why God allows it to continue, other than what he says in his word. He says, you think I'm one like you, that I'm just going to be a human being, but I'm not. Eventually, all of this is going to come to rest at your doorstep. All of these things that you have done as a culture, as individuals, the price must be paid, and divine justice will come. So I'm worried about our culture, deeply and profoundly worried, and not just the secular culture. I think, as I expressed a little bit some of my worries about the contemporary Christian culture as well. I think we're idolizing reason a little too much, and I love reason and rationality, but I think we're making it into a secondary god, and slowly, worshiping God is slowly becoming less important, and worshiping these structures of reason are rising up, and that scares me. I have to be careful there because I don't want to, back when I was in Bible college and earlier, you had this idea of fundamentalists as being backward and ignorant, and to a certain extent, it was, right? These were people who just basically believed and had no reason that they could lay out for why they believed what they believed. And that's a bad thing. We shouldn't be suppressing rationality.
Right.
But I think we've swung too far to the other side of the pendulum. It seems, I don't know, your church background, but I get frustrated in church because it seems like we're always studying the next book by this popular Christian author, and then the next book by this one, and then when a new Christian star rises, and then we study those books, and we neglect to study the book. And that's bothersome.
Yeah.
Not bothersome. It's concerning. It's worrying.
Concerning. Yeah. I absolutely, I think that's a good analysis. And I think the whole question of, reason, I was actually just reading Jung's Ion essay the other day, and he actually mentions that almost explicitly, basically what you just said. That was sort of like one of his main concerns. As from my background, I don't really have too much of a background. I'm kind of just I've actually always been an independent, I guess I'll just call it that. Mm-hmm. I don't have too much of a background. Everything that I've sort of done is I've just kind of read everything on my own. I've never been too much in here or there, but I've always just been drawn towards this stuff more generally. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I'm coming from personally. But I think that that's a really good evaluation of culture. And the question comes up in my mind, of course. The obvious rebuttal is you're telling me to be unreasonable, or you're telling me to be irrational. Yeah. Come on, man, this is crazy. Where you're promoting irrationality. Right. I can just hear people saying that, obviously I know that that's not what you mean at all. And you said so yourself, even in what you just said, but yet still I can hear people saying that in response. And, does it go back to, you're saying, reading the book and basically getting to know God essentially, which is that spiritual pursuit, which is not irrational, but is there a way that you would sort of explain that, to that sort of rebuttal of it's not irrational, it's sort of something else? Or
I think it would follow up on what we've already said. You're telling me I'm being irrational because I'm pursuing the being that is rationality itself, logos, right? So we need, logic, which is sort of coextensive with rationality, is a form. And so what follows from the axiom or the premise that you give, right? You look at the premises and you see what follows. Where does believing these things take me? And if we don't have those substantive premises, there is no logic. And so when I say to someone, I'm pursuing God, I'm pursuing reason incarnate. I mean, that's part of what became incarnate in the Lord Jesus, rationality itself. And so I look at that as the foundation for rationality, because it's a substantive, real rationality, because it has a basis on which and from which to reason. But when you talk about an atheist who has no foundation, reason is just a happenstance, right? There is no real reason. There's no reason to accept our human reason if there's no profound basis. I mean, you said this too in the notes you sent to me. God is the foundation of reason. That's why he says in the beginning of Isaiah, come, let us reason together. It's not a matter of, believe this blindly. No,
Mm-hmm.
I want you to think about these things. I want you to present your questions to me. I want us to think about them together and see where it goes. But if you're going to reason at all, you've got to have axioms. And those axioms, like we talked about with Plato, are the starting points of belief. And you step onto them or you step onto something else. And depending where you step, which raft you choose, you're going to go very different ways.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's really beautifully put. And you basically got to the heart of everything that I've been thinking about personally. And I think that, I just want to ask you a couple questions about that, and then we can wrap up. When someone says to that in response, well, I just do logic because I can do logic. I have my brain does logic. Therefore, that's my basis for doing logic. Why is that not a coherent response to what you're saying?
It is. I mean, that's one of the stories you can create. It's a materialist metaphysics. It's a completely rational position. It's what I would call a hyper-rational position, because all it depends on is what's already there in you. Remember, Sartre said contingency. So you come into existence and you find yourself a rational being, and so you trust your rationality. But you're still left with wondering, why do I trust my rationality? And am I justified in trusting my rationality? And a materialist metaphysic gets all caught up in the fact that they're rationalizing, and they tell a story to themselves about how it's possible, and it's very plausible, it's very compelling, it just emerged and all the rest. And it's beautiful. And so you look into that lake like Narcissus did, and you see your own reflection, and you love it so much that you never stop to question, is it justified? And that's what I think the problem is with hyper-rationality. You are just living in this rational bubble instead of actually trying to ground it. Why should I trust my rationality? Have you ever read anything from Ian McGilchrist?
I haven't read any of his stuff, but I've watched a bunch of interviews with him. Actually, he's a really fascinating guy. He's got a lot of I love that. Actually, I really want to hear what you say. But one thing that I love that he said that resonated with me actually on a personal level was he said that I find myself to be a believer among skeptic and a skeptic among believers, and that really resonated with me. But his work is very interesting. I haven't read any of it, but what were you going to say with respect to him?
I pray for him too when I read his stuff. I mean, he's done an awful lot of empirical research and collation of research in The Master and His Emissary. And it's a long book. It's difficult, but it is tremendous. And he separates the two hemispheres, not in the sort of facile and silly way we used to do years ago, but in a really rigorous empirical scientific study. And he talks about how the left brain tends to be hyper-rational. He doesn't use that word. I'm using it. And it constructs these maps, these pictures, these stories, and it holds on to the story. So that's like Narcissus. And then you have the right brain, which is much more holistic. It actually compares reality with what the left brain gives it. And so his conclusion is that the proper order of things, we need both hemispheres. The proper order of things is that the right brain, which is anchored in reality and experience, must take the evidence and the things that the left brain gives it and make it fit measure it against the evidence, right? So sort of like the scientific process is both. It's the empirical data that you've put a theory to, but you also have to have the independent structure that looks at the theory and the evidence and ties them together and say, does this work? Does it fit? Is it a really good fit? Could we refine it? Should we throw it away and find another theory? And so he calls it the master and his emissary. And it's absolutely fascinating, I think, from a biblical perspective, because we see it in the world around us. And what worries me today is that the hyper-rational is what has carried the day for the last century and a half. And it's very difficult for the right brain then to question things anymore, because this is one. It's the orthodoxy, right? It's the Catholic Church in the medieval period. You dare not question it. And it's taken over. It's become the master instead of properly serving the master.
That's essentially the heart of what he's saying there in his...
it's me reading
from your
what
perspective.
He's saying.
Yeah. Of course. From your perspective, that's
Right.
what he's kind of... Is that his conclusion ultimately about the rational versus the...
It is, yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, that is sort of the defining question of our time, isn't it? Intellectualism, scientism, so on.
Yep.
Beautiful. Well, I think that's all I have. Unless there's anything that you wanted to end with, I'd actually love to know what you've been reading. Maybe we could just end with this. I really like to ask everybody what they've been reading right now, or even if you've been reading anything from the Bible that's been particularly moving. I'd love to end with that.
Okay. You mentioned Mind and Cosmos. I just picked that up, actually. Just started reading it yesterday. I read The Last Word by Nagel last year. Eugene Koonen's book, The Logic of Chance, which is absolutely fantastic. Even though it's an evolutionary thing that I totally disagree with now. He was actually instrumental in helping me recognize the utter failure and the lies that I believed in the evolutionary processes. And then the Bible. Okay, so that's the loaded one for me. Last year, we spent, many months going through meticulously the book of Malachi. And I have it on our podcast, The Christian Atheist, the Malachi series. And I'm presently working on a Malachi Revisited series. And it was mind-blowing for me. I mean, Malachi is one of those books that nobody reads, right? That's the last book in the Old Testament. Why bother with that? It's not very long. It doesn't have much to say. Woo, was I wrong. When I got into that book, it opened up the whole Bible for us, from Genesis to Revelation, really. And so it's about a 10 episode series on the Christian Atheist called Malachi, My Messenger. And if you want to know, what I'm excited about, that's a good place to start. My wife and I are reading Ezekiel right now and finding a lot of really interesting things. And we're reading through the Gospels systematically with some of my wife's kids. So,
cool! I love the first one verses 1 to 9 of Ezekiel. The vision.
That is so weird. What do you make of it?
I mean, that's a good question. I read it a few weeks ago, and I just thought, this is just really beautiful. Okay. I thought it was a great passage. I don't even know why I just opened the Bible and I was like, I'm just going to read whatever, and I came across that and didn't know anything about it from that moment of when I read it, and I just found it to be a really moving passage. A lot of really beautiful imagery came out of it for me. A lot of great symbolism. Just in those 9 verses was just incredible, and it sort of had a lot of interesting corollaries for me from other stuff that I've read too, which I always find interesting, seeing those threads come through other things. What's your thoughts on those verses? I'd love to hear that.
That's Jenny and I both sort of scratch our head at that. And I don't know, but if you found it that fascinating, maybe you should pursue it farther, because that's how God speaks to us. It's like we're reading through the Bible and suddenly something sticks out. And I said, I've read this a million times, but I never saw that before. And so we'll spend hours like chasing down things related to that throughout the rest of the scripture, and how other people have understood it. And it just seems to open things up when we follow those little hints that God seems to put in our paths.
Yeah, actually looking for the other references in the Bible that help to clarify the passage that you're interested in.
Yep.
That's brilliant. Awesome. Yeah, very cool. I'm going to check out that series on, do you happen to remember off the top of your head what episode number it is in your podcast?
I can find it quick for you.
Yeah, check. I'd be curious to check that out for sure. I don't know anything about Malachi, so that would be a good
Malachi the Italian prophet. That's a joke from my Bible college years. Let's see here. Episodes. Let's see. MALACHI. Okay, it starts at 136 and goes through 146. There's probably a few other things in between. And then the new Malachi revisited is 151 and 152.
Cool.
All right.
Awesome. Yeah, great. Great job on the podcast, by the way. You're a very good speaker. I was listening to it last week a bit.
Jenny helps me a lot with that. Poor girl, she has to listen to me say these things over and over again, give me suggestions, incorporate them back and forth with this. So yeah, we're a partnership, and it works really well.
You guys are a great team. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thanks so much again for talking to me, John. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for reaching out.
Yeah. No, it's great to speak with you. Thanks again.
Yep. Stay in contact.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you know somebody else who might like it, please share it with them, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thanks again.